message. It's a message I was working on for many years, thinking about how to read parables of Jesus. So to begin, I would like to say this. One of the most challenging universal human dilemma in biblical and our modern world is understanding the nature and causes of poverty and how we might solve them. Many socially engaged clergy, laypersons, scholars have risen up to take up the challenge with innovating ways to renew communal life by taking on poverty. So the title, Enough to Go Round, as Webster's dictionary has it, it is enough something for all the people who want or need it. To my surprise, as you may know, Google today is very helpful. So a Google search turned up a children's book entitled Enough to Go Round, A Story of Generosity by Kristen Johnson. In the book, a child named Kevin related to his grandmother a conversation he had with his classmates during lunch about the kind of dinner they had the night before. Wondering why Michael said nothing, he asked this question to his grandmother, and the grandmother said, maybe trying to instruct Kevin that there's something we don't know, and Kevin needed to learn that. That is, maybe Michael didn't know what to say. Not everyone has enough to eat. There just isn't enough to go around. This inspired generosity in the heart of Kevin, who invited Michael and his friends to have a food drive that led to the creation of a food pantry. Today, children decry adults' numbness to all types of impending disasters: hunger, poverty, gun violence, climate change, and gender construction that is destructive to life. A handful of Western social scientists and socially engaged biblical scholars, mostly living at the margins of societies, specifically in this case, the global South, reckon with the need to make Scripture, especially Jesus' ministry in Roman Palestine, relevant to their lived experiences of their imperially shaped context by promoting freedom, justice, religious, gender, ethnic, racial, and economic justice. Our passage today is a parable in Luke 14, 16 through 24, although some scholars begin with verse 15. I want to begin with some ideas from Exodus 3, I believe will illustrate the aim of our parable. In Exodus 3, the deity consults and sends Moses, son of a Hebrew slave adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, turned a murderer and a refugee, shepherding the sheep of his father-in-law, Jethro. The deity uses strong words. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. I have come down to deliver them. Now keep that in mind. And that is Exodus 3 through 10. Although I skipped some elements of this passage, I wanted to make a point using what I just read. As the story unfolds, the deity sides with the oppressed, creates a ritual calendar layered with meticulous instructions and imperatives for the perpetual observance of the Passover, and preempts a future generation's question, because children in the future will ask, why this meticulous ritual? And according to the text, they should recount the story of divine deliverance. Okay. The deity frees the oppressed, quenches their thirst with water, and feeds them with rain and bread. So rain here, scholars do say that raining, when you do an intertext, it means not only the manna, but also the quails. So the divine provision of sustenance for the freed community comes with specific instructions to ensure there is enough to go around. What am I saying? God is feeding a freed community and giving specific instructions on how to gather the manna, but also provide them with quail when they complained. All right. Liberated Israel should practice mutualism, and that's the point I'm trying to highlight. Learning from divine instructions on how the food they're sharing, all of them, are you talking, they're having the same menu. That's the lesson to learn from. So the land they will now inhabit, the land where they will dwell, is a non-human being with a perennial agency, if you read Leviticus 25. That land shall observe a Sabbath, and must not be sold in perpetuity. Why? Because the land, according to the text, God says the land is mine. The freed community member divinely transformed from God's people or Israel to aliens and tenants. And if you have a chance to read Leviticus 25, you will see from verses 1 to 23. Levites, the poor, widows, and aliens should have enough to eat. That freed community should learn the lessons to provide for others. Why these divine provisions? Lessons from the debt codes etched in Israel's memory ended up creating a vision of scarcity under empire that undermined the practice of enough to go round. William Herzog writes, the purpose of the debt codes was to create a contrast society in which justice would roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, quoting Amos 5:24. Citing Fernando Bello, Herzog says this in addition. The debt codes were intended to avoid the violence that arises when ruling class begins to exploit and oppress a peasant base. This is the locus of violence that must be exorcised. Keep that in mind. The desire that is brought to bear on the other's source of sustenance, the desire that is the origin of aggressive violence, this violence is the source of the class system, the enrichment of some at the expense of others, and the formation of large-scale ownership. Unfortunately, the debt codes harbored an inner contradiction. As the land yielded abundantly, providing the means to fulfill the principle of extension, it also triggered the desire to accumulate rather than redistribution, redistribute the wealth of the land. Blessing and abundance engendered the covetous desire to have more. This means that the blessing may well develop under the aegis the violence that is the curse. This was certainly the case by the first century in Galilee and Judea. And this is Fernando Bello's work in which Herzog built to provide us with this information. He adds the following. Take the issue of poverty as an example, and this is unquote. Seen through the lenses of the purity code, poverty is the result of impurity or uncleanness. If people lived by the purity codes of the Torah, they would be blessed and prosperous. So poverty is the sign of God's judgment on the unclean. The problem with the poor, not the rich, the problem is with the poor, not the rich who are reaping the rewards of their faithfulness to Torah. Seen through the eyes of the debt codes, however, poverty is the result of covetous greed. It is the consequence of a ruling elite alienating peasants from their land and reducing them to forms of dependency such as tenants and day laborers. The problem is not with the poor, but with the rich. And today we can testify to that. Enough to go around. If poverty is created by the rich, as Herzog insightfully maintains, under imperial Herodian Palestinian context, one can see why Jesus penned this parable. Especially when most of the ruling class was influenced by Roman imperial policies. It is in this political, social, and religious context that Jesus commanded his disciples to set their sight on the kingdom or the reign of God. Luke chapter 12:31. A command to his disciples, the poor peasants, of Galilee under empire and also us in the 21st century in America. As the rich accumulates wealth, the vision embedded in the debt code is undermined. A vision Jesus revives. Jesus describes his ministry this way, and let's not forget this. What does he say? In Luke, the same book, Luke 4:18 through 19. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captive and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then John the Baptist had a question also, wondering whether Jesus was the one who will revive this practice of enough to go around. Jesus responded this way: go tell John that you have seen and what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the leper are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. This brings us then to our parable. So I don't know how many times you read Luke 14, but the word Luke uses is a word that describes economically poor people. So actual poverty was the concern of Luke. He models Jesus' wise teaching in Luke 14:16 through 24 after Greco-Roman symposia. And scholars have highlighted that. They also argue, these scholars, that conflict between Jesus and some of the Pharisees, remember I'm saying some of the Pharisees, over who should recline with whom at meals structurally parallel those in Plato's symposia. In these symposia, rank, social status were standard for ordering banquets among elites, sophists, and other groups. Moralists such as Plutarch decried such banquets because they thought it wasn't moral to do so. So Jesus' ministry and later Luke were not impervious to such practices, which means Luke's community was probably affected by this, thus the parable we have. So my question is, what difference does it make? As he was sharing a meal with a Pharisee, that's how 14 begins, verse 1. On the Sabbath, he restored a person who had ill health. And the text says this is a person with dropsy. Jesus was criticized for doing so during the Sabbath. But then he responded to that, raises powerful questions. They did not have answers to rebut what Jesus said. So Jesus then proceeded and then tried to correct something he saw. A banquet where some people were given places of honor. And then he said, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. That is Luke 14:13. And then he moves to the powerful illustration, which is our parable, and then closes with a call for discipleship. And then says, whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple, Luke 14:27. So Jesus begins the parable with an inclusive invitation. The Greek word used there is polus, which means many. So if it is many, then keep that in mind. The many might presuppose that this person or this person who is inviting, or the host, is inviting a mixed group. So keep that in mind. To which three unnamed elites unanimously declined to attend. The host's subversive invitation of the marginalized, followed by his radical subversion of Roman banquets, he tells his hearers that someone gave a banquet, and then there was this mega. That's a big banquet, great banquet. Scholars have different names for this parable. I wouldn't get to that, but let me move on quickly. That is, the most important invitees, meaning the three who declined, here is what they said. One-sided experience to see a field he bought. The second, obligation to try 5 oxen. The third, could not come because just got married. But wait a minute. You're talking about a banquet, planned. You're talking about people he invited he might have known or his friends. Is that really possible? Having this great banquet according to Luke, and then the friends declined, or the invitees declined. Well, there must be a reason for that. So since polus meant many, probably they declined, and here I'm raising a question. Could the polus, the Greek polus, many, meant to give us a hint as we read this parable? Does it include people the three thought they shouldn't really dine with? Think about that. So they gave their excuses. The householder would have known, if they were friends, that one of them had planned a marriage. So a marriage is something you plan. Buying a field is an economic transaction. Buying oxen is also an economic transaction. So surely they talked about the banquet and also what they were doing. But let's move on. The excuses of the most valued guests angered the host, which implies they must have known the day and time of the banquet and could have avoided a conflict of schedule. Some scholars have pointed to the fact that the first invaluable guests would have gone to inspect the field before buying it. Others say the same for the oxen. The third, surely, this is something planned, right? And would have invited also this host who invited him for the banquet. In other words, as I move on, some degree of planning would have happened. So the parable is spun to raise questions, to have us think about what's going on and what Luke was trying to do, recalling to his community about what Jesus did and said. So the householder makes a strategic subversive move. He resent his invitees to invite who? The poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame on the streets and lanes. And this is a named city. We don't know which city this was. So because it's a parable, the parable is concerned with teaching us a lesson. So initial invitees, I argued earlier, have included people of low status, the poor, marginalized, who Jesus basically restored their sight and proclaimed cancellation of debt. Jesus reassured John the Baptist about this very crucial dimension of the ministry. Some Greco-Roman physiognomics would have excluded these people listed, the second invitees, meaning those who are able differently. So, by doing that, Luke is trying to raise a question for us when we read the parable. And a professor at Baylor University, Michael Parson, has a convincing argument. What does he say? Please listen to his words. Unquote. Luke at times employs physiognomic categories in his literal representation of certain characters, usually for the purpose of subverting them. For Luke, this is radically inclusive community comprised of not only sinners and social outcasts, but also the physically disabled and the disfigured who on the basis of the appearance of their physical body have been ostracized as misfits from the body politics. Building on Parsons' thesis, I argue that Luke subverts physiognomics to include marginally or differently able people. They are God's able bodies who embody divine vision for God's own communities, or let me just say, a model for those who will become the children of God. So I began by arguing that enough to go around was central to God's work of liberation and justice. God hears and identifies with the suffering and oppressed, those inflicted with brutalism, of which Kenneth Ngoa calls the ideology of erasure, alienation, and singularity. Feeding stories of liberated people in Exodus and divine command for Israel to ensure there is enough to go around, especially the poor, the widow, and the alien, are meant for Israel and the followers of Jesus to emulate. And I would say for us to emulate in the 21st century. Leslie Hope also highlighted that the rabbis did struggle with this. They thought poverty will be with us. However, they thought also that humans in community had the power to end poverty. So some rabbis also talk about Abraham, comparing Abraham with Job. They noted that Job would invite people in his house, several doors, and they will get in. But what Job doesn't do, he doesn't go and find them. So the comparison then contrasts Job with Abraham, who would go out, seek them out, bring them, feeds them. That's not the only thing he does. He also builds some houses where there are doors and they can come in and there's food, just like Kevin inspired his friends to create a food pantry. Abraham had that, and so when you get in, you eat to your fill, and then you get out and tell people about it. So that comparison is striking. Also in Senegal, West Africa, we had a prophet. She was young. She was between 20 and 21, where she became a crucial prophet speaking against French colonization. What did she do? She created a community where everyone, despite of your religious beliefs or ethical conviction or ethnicity, you are invited in her community to eat. And what does she do? She calls her own community members to cook food and invite strangers. And this is my Jola people. This prophet is from my Jola people. Now, what about the Muslims? The third pillar of Islam also encourages supporting those who do not have. In fact, a portion is to be set out to ensure solidarity with the poor is practiced. That's not the only thing the Sufi Muslim in Senegal did. So they also encourage supporting students, supporting those who are differently able, supporting those in need, dire need. The Christians in Senegal, I'm talking about 2%, or that number probably increased over time, did the same. They also supported the poor. They also created a way in which not only the poor, but also people who need any help. Now, don't look at what I'm saying as a perfection. No. They try to ensure the needy has enough. So this brings me to my conclusion. My conclusion then is, Riverside, I want you to hear this because it's crucial to what I do in the classroom. So today what I did is not a sermon. It's kind of a class discussion. And I would ask you a question that I want you to respond to in your own way. You don't have to say it here. But think about it, meditate, and let your spirituality work through it. Luke 14:16 through 24 embeds more than a wait-and-see eschatology. Some read it as an eschatological parable for the messianic banquet. But notice, that language is in the future. But I'm arguing, Luke is saying the future should be reflected in the present. We should do something that is showing divine presence among us. So Jesus reevaluated banqueting, reevaluated sharing meals where everyone is invited. So any eschatological or messianic meal indifferent to human needs in this age, notice, this age, not the age to come, in this age is useless to Jesus' hearing and also to us. The householder is one of those wealthy individuals who can afford banquets and would invite hosts who are probably his peers. A predilection to the kind of reciprocity Luke challenges. This is according to a scholar in the Netherlands, in Norway. The Gospel of Luke not only had a predilection for the needy, it also addresses the appropriate use of wealth with regard to the needy. The oikodespotes, which is the householder in Greek, being shamed by his peers who refused to come because perhaps he invited people they didn't like, decided to redefine his previously held social convictions that helped stratify society, a decision Willie Braun rightly calls a conversion. God in the Exodus taught Israel to look around and practice enough to go around. The conversion of the householder transformed his perception, enabling him to look around and share meals with the denigrated, meaning the friends of God, according to Scripture. Aliou C, the prophet from West Africa, created an inclusive community and meals which he shared with all who come, male and female. Let me not just use that, just let me use the word all who come. All people who come to her community, they are fed. She shows that divine presence is in the midst of her ministry, even though she wasn't a Christian. She wasn't a Muslim. She was an African traditionalist. Kevin was inspired to create a food pantry with his peers. In the quotation listed in the bulletin, Paulette Nadal challenges her community members in Martinique, saying this: divine charity does not need to be defended. Its countless deeds speak for themselves. Social action and its admirable accomplishment is the modern form of charity and one of the faces of social justice, constituted the integral imperative for all, because poverty does not wait. Here is my question as I close. What did you hear, Riverside? What did you hear from the reading, the contextualizing this parable, bringing in our modern concerns? What did you hear? Meditate in it. But here is what I heard me saying: look around and exercise enough to go around in times like these. Thank you.